Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Ashley Moore, and I'm going to be talking to you today about myself, about my research, and also a little bit about graduate school, which is something I have only just graduated from a couple of years ago, so something that's fresh on my mind and hopefully something that you guys are interested in as well. So like I said, my name is Dr. Ashley Moore. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the psychology department at SUNY Oswego, and I teach a variety of courses. I teach research methods, biopsychology, developmental psychology, and abnormal psychology. The reason I teach so many different courses is I come from a sort of multidisciplinary training program. My PhD is in psychiatric, behavioral, and statistical genetics, which I usually just shorten to behavioral genetics to make it easier for people. And we'll talk about what that means in just a second. And I've also lived pretty much from coast to coast in the US. I was born in Southern California, but I lived most of my sort of early adulthood in the South, in Tennessee and Virginia. And now, of course, I'm in New York. So I've experienced a lot of different environments in the US, which has been helpful. So let's talk about what behavioral genetics is. So behavior genetics, if you think about those two words individually, is really just a field that studies the underlying genetic causes of behavior. And in addition to behavior, we also look at things like mental health and psychopathology. So it's really a combination of psychology and genetics. There's usually two different fields you can kind of go into in behavior genetics. Some researchers use twins. That is used to quantify the influence of genes and environment on behavior. So determining how much genes influence a trait, maybe like schizophrenia, versus how much environment influences it. So we use twins here and a lot of math to determine this type of information. Other behavior genetics researchers use molecular techniques. So these people actually look at the DNA, either via saliva or blood, something like that, and they look at specific variants and they see if those genetic variants are associated with certain traits in humans. So I have done both of these types of research, but most of my research focuses on twin studies in terms of developing and quantifying the heritability of specific traits, specific diseases, specific disorders, etc. So let's talk about how I got here. I think that's important because if you're anything like me when I was an undergraduate, you just sort of assume that your professors were born knowing they wanted to be professors and teach, but that's not necessarily the case. It certainly isn't in my case. So I started out in community college, and I loved every class I took. So I had a lot of different majors. I had the problem of, having too much interest in too many things. And the thing I distilled that down to in the end was that I knew that I liked learning and I liked college. And so when I went into my bachelor's degree, I thought there's got to be some way that I can sort of, for lack of a better term, stay in college or stay in school for the rest of my life. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll teach, or maybe I'll be like a school counselor or something in psychology. And that was kind of my plan. And I took my research methods class in psychology, and that really cemented that I wanted to do research. In high school, I'd always thought research was sort of boring and drab and going to the library and reviewing, articles, and, research is some of that, but it's so much more. The fact that you can ask an empirical question about fundamental human nature and then design a study to answer that question is really, I couldn't think of anything more exciting than that. And so I loved it. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll be an experimental psychologist. Maybe I'll, go to graduate school for that. And that was, again, sort of the plan until my last summer class that I took, I think it was like 6 months before I graduated, kind of threw all of that into a tailspin because I took a class in genetics. And you want to talk about interesting. I was fascinated by genetics. And I was already a biology minor, but it really made me think like, gosh, I should have been taking more biology classes. This is super interesting stuff. And so I started to do research with a genetic professor and with a psychology professor. I tried to kind of combine the two and see if I could make those fields mesh. I wanted to be potentially the way I thought I could make them mesh was by being a genetic counselor who works in mental health or medicine and counsels people on their genetic results. So that was sort of my way of thinking about that I could combine the two. And it wasn't until I was actually shadowing a genetic counselor that I found out that there was this field called behavior genetics that you could get a PhD in and do research in the genetics of behavior. And that was perfect. I knew that was what I wanted to do as soon as I heard the field. But I think it's important that, it's an important lesson to think about the fact that as an undergraduate where you guys are and where I was, you may not even know the career options that are available to you. You may not even know the fields that exist. So if you have interests, strong interests, like I was, psychology, biology, and research, or psychology, genetics, and research, talk to the people in those fields and ask them, are there career paths that I don't know about that combine these? Because more than likely there are. There are so many career paths that you don't even hear about until you're well into your adult life. And that's kind of sad, because if we knew about them earlier, we could, go down those paths easier. So just talk to as many people as you can if you have strong interest and you're trying to figure out, what you want to do. There might be some really cool stuff you've never heard of. And so, of course, that led me to my PhD, which was in behavior genetics. There was only a few schools in the US that offered that type of degree. I think there was 3 schools. So a very small field, but I did figure it out, and got into one of those programs. So let's talk now a little bit about my research and what I do. And mainly, my main focus in psychology is psychopathic traits. And so we use the term psychopath pretty loosely in society, but there's a lot of different ways one might be a psychopath or have psychopathic traits. So some of the traits you will see in a psychopath are things like the superficial charm, obviously being insincere or untruthful, having a lack of remorse and a lack of empathy. And these are the things I mainly focus on, is the lack of empathetic response or remorse for your behavior. But there's also behavioral traits, so things like being impulsive or having excessive risk-taking, being manipulative. And certain people can have some of these traits, others can have different traits. So you might have 2 very different psychopaths. So it really is more of a constellation of traits than necessarily like a hard and fast disorder. In fact, it's not even a diagnosable disorder, psychopathy, but I study it nonetheless. And so the main area of my research is the biology of psychopathic fear. So researchers have noted for a long time that psychopaths process fear differently. There's many different ways that it's different from your normal individual. So they tend to show less startle response. So when someone sneaks up on you and taps you on the shoulder, that sort of response, the startling response, psychopaths tend to have less of that. They also are harder to condition to fear something. Most people, when you shock them and present a stimulus every time you give them a shock, such as like an apple, they will learn to not like or to fear the stimulus, or an apple. Probably not a great example, but psychopaths have a harder time being conditioned to fear things than the average individual. And also psychopaths tend to have a problem identifying emotions in others, like fear or distress. And so all of this is really the area I'm most interested in, and I look at how genes, physiology, and even neuroanatomy impact this processing. So a couple of my current research findings. The first is that throughout development, so we're talking middle childhood to young adulthood, men tend to increase in their psychopathic traits more than women. And this is pretty well established already. When you're a child, men and women tend to have similar levels of psychopathic traits, but as we get into adolescence and adulthood, that's when the trajectory of men tends to increase. And so men tend to have more psychopathic traits than women. And this pretty much lasts throughout the life course. The heritability of psychopathic traits also increases during that time, so from childhood to, say, early adulthood. So I have 2 graphs here. One is showing additive genetic, which we usually just call A, and environment, which we call E. And we see that from the ages of, say, 9 to 20, the genetic influence on these traits increases, and the environmental influence decreases. So what that means is that as a child, your psychopathic traits may be more due to environment, whereas in adulthood, someone with psychopathic traits may be more due to genetics. So taken in combination with that previous chart, it might be that the genetics in men are starting to be expressed a little bit more in early to mid-adulthood. And then in childhood, those traits are pretty much just due to the environment we're living in. So even though I've just talked about the fact that females tend to have lower levels of psychopathic traits, there also appear to be some biological differences that may influence that finding. In that, in women, um, the children that develop into women with psychopathic traits tend to have stronger associations with some biological findings than in men. So that gives some evidence to where maybe it is more biological in females and maybe more environmental in males, although more research would definitely be needed in this area. But it's definitely interesting. So a couple of the ways in which females have stronger associations with some biological things when they're psychopaths is that female psychopaths tend to have lower startle response, harder time being conditioned to fear something. They also even have neuroanatomical differences. So there's a decrease in the cingulate cortex thickness with higher levels of psychopathic traits. But again, all of these are really only seen in the children that are female that will, eventually develop psychopathic traits, not necessarily in the males. So here's a graph that depicts this relationship with neuroanatomy. So we're looking at, on the x-axis, the right cingulate cortex thickness, as well as on the y-axis, we're looking at their level of psychopathy. So in males, the cingulate thickness tends to be pretty even depending on the level of CU traits. So there's not really an association here. Whereas in females, there is an association. You see that sloped gray line, which shows that with higher psychopathic traits, they tend to have thinner cortex in this particular area. Whereas when the CU traits or the psychopathic traits are lower, then women tend to have more of an average or normal thickness. So this is a really interesting finding that may indicate there's different mechanisms between how men and women go on to develop psychopathic traits. Another thing is that adolescents with psychopathic traits have a harder time identifying distress. And by distress, what I mean is the emotions of fear and the emotion of sadness in others. And this association I looked at in a twin sample and determined that the association between psychopathy and this hard time identifying emotions is due to the entire same set of genes that influence both traits. So it's a completely genetic link. The same genes that are causing this decreased recognition of emotions in psychopaths is also leading to those same psychopathic traits. So that's a summary of my research. Now what I want to do is talk about graduate school. And I could give hours-long lectures on graduate school, so could any of your professors. But what I think I'm going to narrow it down to is just the 4 things I wish I'd known about graduate school that nobody told me. And let me preface this with saying that a lot of professors come from families who have people in their families who have gone to graduate school. And if this applies to you, if you have family members that have gone to graduate school, some of this may be common knowledge to you. But I was someone who did not have any family members who'd gone to graduate school. In fact, neither of my parents graduated from college. My mom was the first person in her whole family to graduate from high school. So I did not know anything about graduate school. And no one really ever told me until almost my last semester of undergraduate. These things that are really important to know. And I think knowing them earlier than later will help you make a decision. Because if I was in a classroom right now, I would ask you to raise your hand if you were interested in graduate school. And I can tell you at least 50% of psychology majors always raise their hand that they're interested in graduate school. So this is an important topic to sort of understand as you go through your undergraduate courses. So the first thing is that graduate school is hard. And I know we sort of intuitively know that, but it's really hard. And there are some statistics that we can show that kind of back this up, just for you to get an idea of the difficulty. So only about 70% of master's students complete their degree, and only about 45% of PhD students complete their degree. And that drops even lower when we look at humanities, like psychology, it's 29%. So these are huge dropout rates, which just speaks to how hard it actually is. It's actually hard mentally and physically as well. So graduate students tend to have poor mental health in the general population, including things like depression, suicidal ideation, and divorce rates are incredibly high among graduate students. So this is not said to scare you off. This is said to let you know that this is not something to be taken lightly, a decision to be taken lightly. You really need to think about whether graduate school is something you want to do, whether it's something you might enjoy doing, rather than just going into it because it's really the only thing you can think of to do. It's hard, but I can tell you it's definitely worth it if it's something you want to do. The other thing is that it's really hard to get in. And again, I think this is something we kind of know, but we don't really ever get told, or at least like I said, I didn't, how you have to go about your life in order to think about getting into graduate school in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, whatever your trajectory is. So I recommend you start working on your resume now. If you're a freshman, start working on your resume now. There are lots of things you can do over the next 4 years that you can just plug into that resume and just make it grow and grow and grow during your 4 years here. So you can volunteer. You can volunteer at a lot of different organizations. There are certain organizations that have specific things that might look good if you're interested in psychology. For example, I volunteered at the Trevor Project, which is a suicide hotline for LGBTQ youth. And that allowed me to work from home and get some training in how to be a counselor. And I would counsel individuals who were suicidal via chat. There was a chat function, there was a call function, there was a website function, something like that. If you look for something that fits into what you're interested in, that will look really great on your resume. You can also become a teaching assistant. And as an undergraduate teaching assistant, what looks really good on a resume is research methods and stats. Those are the two classes that look great when you're a TA for those, because when you go into graduate school, that's what you're going to be doing, a lot of research methods and a lot of stats. So that's something you can do. Talk to your professors. If you're taking a course with them and you're doing well in research methods or stats, ask them, hey, do you need a TA in the next semester or year? I would love to do that. And if you're doing good in their class, they will be excited to have you come up and ask. The other thing is to do lots of research. So you can do research in research methods, but you can also ask your professors to do research with them. And you can do that with multiple professors. I did it with a professor in psychology, actually 2 professors in psychology, and a professor in genetics. And so you can have all of this experience on your resume that makes you look like a really well-rounded person to get into graduate school. The third thing, and the third and fourth thing are the things that sometimes when I talk about this blow people's minds, especially if you come from a family like mine with no experience with graduate school. Most PhD programs pay their students. You don't pay them. They will pay your tuition, it's free, and they will pay you a stipend, meaning they will actually pay you to live, to like, a couple grand a month or whatever that changes to via inflation, to be a research assistant or a teaching assistant so that you can afford to live in an apartment, buy your food, buy all the supplies you need. So free tuition and you get this stipend. Now, again, remember, it's very hard to get into these programs. So I'm not saying, just go do it, it'll be easy. But if you do get into them, it's not something that necessarily you have to worry about the money to get in. I was in a situation where I was like, of course I would love to do a PhD, but there's no way I can afford that. I'm just barely trying to make it through undergraduate. And once I found out this, it really changed everything for me. I was a good student. I wanted to do more education, but this changed everything. The other thing that will sometimes blow people's minds, again, when you know it and it makes sense. But if you don't know it, it's like an eye-opening experience to know that you do not need a master's degree to get a PhD. In almost all cases, you never need a master's degree. Now, can you get a master's degree? Yes, you usually have to pay for that. Usually you aren't paid to be in a master's program. But almost all programs do not require a master's degree. I went into a PhD program right out from my undergraduate. A lot of the professors in your psychology department got their PhD right after their undergraduate with no master's. So don't necessarily think that you have to have that linear path of undergraduate, master's, and PhD. The master's is sort of a step you can take, but you do not have to. So like I said, some of this may be completely new to some of you, which I'm glad I got to share that information with you before I got to hear it as a senior in undergraduate. And for some, it may be, of course, I knew this. My parents went to graduate school. They've told me. But I think it's good that we all sort of have that information. Oh, my dog agrees. So I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions, you can email my dog. I don't know if you can hear them barking, but if you can. This is what it's come to. But anyway, email me any questions you have, and I'd be happy to answer them. And I wish you guys really good luck this semester and in your future. And I hope to see some of you in person. Bye.